The Pope's second-in-command is denying the obvious connection between gay priests and the crisis of clerical sex abuse. Join us with the latest from the Eternal City, Church Militant Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, what's the Vatican's top cardinal saying about the root causes of clergy sex abuse?
Brad, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who could very well be our next pope, is telling us that there is no scientific basis to correlate clergy sex abuse with what we now know is an abundance, a preponderance of homosexuals in the Catholic priesthood.
And where's he coming out with these statements?
He wrote a preface to a book that has recently been published. The book is called The Pain of the Church in the Face of Abuse. It's written in Italian, and a prominent psychologist, a former bishop, and a theologian have made significant contributions to the whole debate on clerical sex abuse in this just published book.
And what specifically is Parolin's take in all this?
Parolin says this, let me quote. He says there is no serious, there's the link between gay clergy and sex abuse is a serious and scientifically untenable association. He then goes on to say, homosexual orientation cannot be considered as either cause or aspect typical of the abuser, even more so when it is decoupled from the general arrangement of the person. I'm not sure what he means by that, but he goes on to say that the root of the problem, particularly with regard to the abuse of minors, is the psychological disorientation of the priest. And he advocates for better formation in terms of maturity, psychological makeup, but also psychological screening to be very intense before candidates are admitted into seminary. And he says this should go on, continue, not just while a priest, a seminarian, is undergoing formation, but post-ordination as well.
Well, that's a lot of dancing around the whole issue here, because okay, let's talk about a top psychologist, Jules, who also is a priest, who would beg to disagree with Parolin, who's crunched all these numbers. What is his take on this?
Well, we're talking about Father Sullins, and I've spent the morning reading his excellent academic paper published in a peer-reviewed journal. And he analyzes, Father Paul Sullins analyzes the 2011 John Jay College report. He analyzes the 2004 and 2011, these two extensive reports. And he says, he answers this question, is sexual abuse by Catholic clergy related to homosexuality? He answers it with an affirmative and resounding yes. And he says, let me quote just one sentence, of the remaining 95% of abuse that took place with minors aged 8 to 17 years, the overwhelming majority of incidents, 83% in the grand jury report and 82% in the John Jay College data, consisted of male-on-male abuse. So what Sullins is saying, quite emphatically, and this paper is really worth reading, he's saying that we often talk about pedophilia, and we are not really understanding that the problem is not abuse of, tiny toddlers, but it is the abuse of post-pubescent adolescent boys. Many of these boys are easy prey for abuser priests, and these boys tend to be altar boys or minor seminarians. And, Father Sullins' verdict is devastating. And of course, Brad, Archbishop Timothy Broglio, who is now the president of the United States Conference of Bishops, also made this comment in 2018, repeated it last year. And people left-wingers were very angry at him when he said that.
Yeah, so now, I mean, just setting aside Broglio and Sullins and anybody else who wants to comment on the numbers don't lie. The numbers were compiled by John Jay Report, as you say, and other studies, and they're all saying somewhere north of 8 and 10 cases of sex abuse were a male in the church in leadership, priest, on a post-pubescent boy, a post-pubescent young man. So clearly it's a homosexual crisis. You can talk all you want about not being mature and psychological, this and that, but the numbers don't lie that 8 and 10 of the abuse was a homosexual. Let's move on for just a second. Some say the sex abuse crisis could somehow be solved by allowing married men to become priests. But marriage is for straight people, not gay men. So that 8 and 10 of those who were abusers wouldn't be affected by this. They're not attracted to having a valid marriage to a woman. How's Parolin's view on the whole question of celibacy, relaxing rules on the men who will be ordained? Because we know that priests aren't allowed to marry, but this is only a question for those who will become ordained, marriage prior to ordination. What's his take on celibacy for those people?
Well, that's a very good point, and he does agree that getting rid of celibacy won't solve the problem of clergy sex abuse. But Brad, he doesn't say what you have just said, because to say what you've just said would be tantamount to admitting the very high rate of homosexual abuse in the priesthood. However, in the book, the Spanish theologian who is writing, he says that it's high time for the church to make celibacy optional and to consider ordaining married men. Now, the problem with that, and I've spoken to many married priests in the ordinariate, the Anglican ordinariate, and they say most of them come with their wives and children, of course, and they tell me again that the problem is the bishops simply do not want married men, not because they believe celibacy is an ancient clerical tradition, but because a married priest simply upset this apple cart of the gay cabal that is so deeply entrenched in the priesthood. And that is the reason, incidentally and interestingly, why most bishops simply do not want married men in the Catholic priesthood.
Wow, because they wouldn't get along with a homosexual priest in the priesthood. That's quite a take. I mean, really. What else, Jules, is controversial in this particular book that Parolin wrote the preface for?
Well, the controversial bit, of course, is the, getting rid of celibacy and basically trying to establish that this wasn't a tradition, that goes from the scriptures. Comes from the New Testament. We do know, of course, Paul in 1 Timothy and in Titus says that a bishop, a priest, presbyter, and a deacon, must be the husband of one wife. And the authors try to make a theological case for the married priesthood, but then continue to defend the fact that Parolin is right, and it's the big pink elephant in the gay vestry. There is no homosexual problem in the Catholic priesthood. That, I would say, is the most controversial aspect of this book.
Yeah, the whole thing is, like you say, taking it as if celibacy would somehow solve the problem. When Benedict came out in 2005 and again in 2008, under him, the dicastery said, stop ordaining homosexual men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies. Jules, the whole connection between homosexual clerics and clerical sex abuse is statistically so obvious. Why do you think, personally, top church leaders like Parolin are trying so desperately to deny this obvious connection?
If you read this 700 to 800 page investigative journalistic book by the French journalist, who himself is gay, by the way, Frédéric Martel. It's called In the Closet of the Vatican. It's very clear why they do not want to admit this, because Martel establishes how some of the top cardinals are not just homosexual, but use what we in Europe call rent boys, go to Termini and pick up male prostitutes. And Martel goes on to demonstrate how there is an extensive network of homosexuals in the priesthood. Of course, we now know, Sullins himself talks about this, how this network has been, exists for the last 40 years or more, particularly in seminaries. And it is there where this culture of homosexuality, making relationships, forming what I think Pope Francis himself called the gay mafia, has become, very, very strong and intense.
Yeah, if memory serves, that in the 80s, later 80s, it peaked, and it was somewhere, Sullins was saying, somewhere north of 50% of the seminarians were reporting that there was a gay subculture, extensive subculture in the seminaries, and they had to be formed within that. And all the goodbye, good men, if you weren't going to put up with all that, you wound up leaving. Well, the numbers, Jules, don't lie. We'd ask our viewers actually to pray for the cleansing of the priesthood in the Catholic Church. Studies all show that more than 8 in 10 cases of abuse are perpetrated by gay clerics, and when the hierarchy will come clean about that, it's anybody's guess. So, Jules, thank you very much for your report and for your analysis.
Thank you, Brad.